Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just did our final most impactful freshman for every big time conference contender. We went through all of the Power Four conferences and broke down all of those, and that was a very, very fun segment. So if you want to go check out the other segments, definitely go do that. But let's get into a top 10 Tuesday now, and I'm going to give you my preseason top 10 to start, but then we're going to get into the biggest games for those preseason top 10 teams. And this doesn't necessarily mean the biggest game in terms of fandom or in terms of TV sales or in terms of the hype going into it. It's just where I think the hinge point is in their season, where I think the biggest game is in terms of so many different things, whether it's this season, next season, a legacy type pick. There are a ton of different things in here, and I'll explain them as we go. But let's start at number 10. And I have Utah as my number 10 team, and I think at Oklahoma State is the game. On September 21st, they travel to Stillwater and play under the darkest sky in America. It is going to be absolutely crazy, and I think this is the moment that Utah can kind of plant their flag in this conference. They're coming in as the big-time favorite. They're coming in as the team that everyone thinks is going to win this conference. Well, this would be the moment that either Oklahoma State can kind of put them in their place a little bit, or Utah can, confirm all that for all of us and make it known that this is their conference until further notice, because they would be walking into, frankly, the toughest place to play in the Big 12 for quite some time in Oklahoma State. And then if Utah wins this game, they will have a ton of slack. The schedule in front of them after this game is not very tough. And I think with this conference, there's going to be a ton of two-loss teams in these conference games that it's going to be really, really interesting to see how the tiebreakers work out at the end of the year. But at the end of the day, if Utah does win this game, the amount of slack they'll have to get to Arlington will be plenty. I'll just put it that way. But then number 9, I have Penn State there, and it's at USC. I know that sounds a little bit crazy because obviously they want to beat Michigan and Ohio State more than they want to beat any other team on the schedule. But I do think this one's huge. I think when you travel to USC being late in the process of kind of building out that defense that they're going to be doing this year, and then you have that perfect storm of heading into a 2-game stretch of at Wisconsin and Ohio State, you got to win this one. You just have to, because you could be going into a stretch where maybe you split those games, maybe you lose both of those games, but at the end of the day, if you start off with a win, you give yourself at least a fighting shot to stay in this playoff race. So that's going to be a huge game on October 12th, and I think it's one that might be, Penn State might walk in and totally win by, 20 points, but I could also see a reality where USC ends up playing better defense than we expect them to play, and makes this game really interesting. So I think this is a game that maybe won't be the most interesting for Penn State fans when you look at the schedule, but is going to be huge for this team to get a win in this game. And then Missouri at Texas A&M, I think, is absolutely huge for them, and this is kind of where it falls on the schedule as well. They are going into a stretch of Auburn at Bama and OU after this game, and you got to walk in there with a win. You just have to. It's going to be so tough to come out of there with any chance to go to the playoff or especially go to the SEC title if you do not go into Kyle Field and get that win. It's going to be absolutely huge for this team, and frankly, A&M is that team that I'm watching to sink someone's chances in the SEC, whether it is Missouri or LSU or Texas at the end of the season. They feel like a team that is going to ruin some fun for someone, and it's going to be really interesting to watch who that team would be, but it definitely could be this Missouri team, and it's a remarkably tough place to play, but with everything coming up on the schedule after this game, Missouri definitely needs this one. And then I'm going to stay right there in Kyle Field for the next one. I think this Notre Dame game is huge, and I think they are the number 7 team in the country. This one's going to be very, very interesting because it is the first game of the season. It's hard to say that this is the most important game of the season, but when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, they do have Florida State, they do have Louisville. I think that Georgia Tech game is very interesting, and they're going to want to be a little bit more careful about that one than some people might think right now, but I think that game in Kyle Field is going to define their season because if you start 0-1, I think you've lost all of your slack. I think a 10-2 season would put you right on the bubble in the playoff, and a 9-3 season would outright bury you. A win here is just absolutely huge. It's something that I don't necessarily know if they need to make the playoff, but if they don't get it, then they might just have to run the table to make the playoff. So I think this is one of those games that, yes, it is at the beginning of the season, and yes, it won't necessarily define who Notre Dame is as a team throughout the season, but it could define their playoff chances at the end of the day, and that would be a very, very interesting thing to watch. So I know it's a week 1 game, but I'm leaning into Texas A&M being Notre Dame's biggest game this upcoming season. Ole Miss, for me, it's at LSU. I think there's a number of energy, or there's so much energy around that UGA and that Bama game, and I totally understand it. That's the games that could, anoint them into the higher level of the SEC, but also this is a game that can do that. The teams that have been at the top of the SEC for quite some time beat teams like LSU consistently, and not necessarily every single year, because that's just ridiculous. No one can really do that, but beating them 2 out of the 3 years is huge for some of these teams like Alabama to kind of keep that sustained success. Beating that team, LSU, has been one of the biggest things that they've done on a consistent basis, and if they can do it over there in Ole Miss, then they're starting to make their way up into that Alabama, Georgia conversation, rather than being in that kind of middle of the pack that is somewhat of a nightmare to be in the SEC. So that one is definitely the one that I think Ole Miss just absolutely needs a win, and they got one last year, but definitely got some luck in their direction in that game. But moving on to number 5, I do have Alabama as my number 5 team. At Tennessee is the one that I'm circling. Everyone will circle UGA, and I totally get that, and it is absolutely huge for this team. But when I look at that game, I don't necessarily think Alabama's going to win, and I don't necessarily think that kills them if they lose, because I do think there is a certain energy that, Bama doesn't want to lose that game. I'm not saying that, but I do think fans kind of understand where they're at, and they kind of understand that Georgia is coming in as the favorite. They are coming in as the team with a little bit more stability. So although that's going to be a game that is going to be blown out to the nth degree and be just absolutely huge for that team, I think Tennessee is the one that could make or break their season. They have a run at Tennessee, Missouri, at LSU. Starting that with a win gives you a ton of slack going into that back end of that season. And when you have Missouri coming to town, you got to feel confident about that one. So you got to continue that domination in that third week of October. It's obviously something that's very tough, and Tennessee very much wants to get that win for the second time in 3 years. But at the end of the day, this is the one for me that if Bama loses it, I think they're not a playoff team. If they win it, I think they're very much in that conversation. And then number 4, I do have Texas as my number 4 team. I have Oklahoma here. And again, UGA would be the normal answer here. But at the end of the day, I do think there's a ton of things going into this game. Obviously, losing a year ago to OU is going to be a thorn in Texas' side. They do not want that to happen again. They are going to do everything in their ability to make that not happen again. So that obviously adds to this, of course. But also, it's right after, the UGA game is right after this one. This is a very, very tough 2-week stretch. They are going into a 2-week stretch that is maybe one of the tougher of the entire college football season, and you got to make sure that you're ready to go during that game. You have to make sure that whether you are, going into a game, I might have that flipped, actually. They might play Georgia earlier. I can't remember. But at the end of the day, this is a 2-game stretch that you need to at least split. And Oklahoma, I would argue, is the more important one to win, in my opinion, because you lost it last year because it's a rivalry and because I don't think there's too many people that are really expecting Texas to beat Georgia. But at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be a huge win, whether it's, coming off a big win against Georgia or going into a big game against Georgia. I think it's going to be a game that Texas just needs to put in the win column. And then Oregon, this one is a very easy one. Ohio State is obviously the biggest game on the schedule for them, and it's the moment. It's the moment where Dan Lanning and this team that has so much hype going into this season, that wants to do so many different things, confirms all of those things, confirms all of the hype around them, confirms that they are a team that is going to be a problem in the Big Ten going forward. And this would be a huge statement to make. There's no two ways about that. So I think if Oregon's going to take over the conference in year one, this would be where they would make that statement. They don't necessarily need to win it to make the Big Ten championship, but it would go a really, really long way and would definitely make them the team to beat. There's no two ways about that. And then number 2, the easiest one on here. Ohio State has to beat Michigan. Period. End of story. If they don't win this game, whether they walk in 11-0 or they walk in 5-7 or 5-6, you got to win this game. This is the game for this team this upcoming year, and Sharon Moore is coming in trying to ruin that. And it'll be really interesting to see if he can. I mean, he's seen the blueprint the last 3 years of how to go at this team and how to beat this team, and it'll be really, really interesting to watch. But this is without question the biggest game for Ohio State this upcoming year, and it's without question maybe the biggest game for any singular team this upcoming year, because if they lose this game 4 years in a row, there is going to be some Ohio State fans that they're going to do some things that are going to be questionable by law. I'll just put it that way. It's going to be a crazy, crazy time up there in Columbus, and I can almost promise you they will not want Ryan Day as their head coach going forward. I can say that pretty confidently. So that's obviously the biggest game, maybe of the entire year, but definitely for Ohio State. And then finally, Georgia's my number one team. At Bama is the game. This one's very easy. In my opinion, it's one of the biggest games of the year and could be one of the most defining games in the next 5 years of the SEC, because I think this is the game where maybe it's the passing of the torch, the official, Georgia taking over this conference and being the team to beat, and Bama kind of taking that little bit of a step back and becoming that tier 2 team that is fighting like LSU, like Ole Miss, like some of those other teams. So this could be the moment that Georgia fans have waited for quite some time, because Saban just kept beating them. But at the end of the day, September 28th is going to be a huge day. It could be the passing of the torch. It could be Bama saying, nah, we're just going to keep it for quite some time now. So it will be really, really interesting to watch that game. And I think when I look at this season and I'm trying to get the most excited for one game in particular, it might just be this one. I think this is the one that I think, between atmosphere and anger and the stakes behind it, this one just hits a little bit different than all the other ones on the schedule. So very, very excited about that one. And I think Georgia, you got to get the win. If you can get the win, then the SEC is effectively yours and you can hold on to it for quite some time. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.